We're still waiting for Jonathan and Quentin, but we can get started. It's 9:05. All right. So do you want to start the recording? Say what do you want to say?
Yeah, I'm just starting the recording. This is the Federation SIG of May 1st, 2017.
Okay. So we are recording this now. Right?
Right.
Great. So we can get started. So we have a lot of things on agenda today, and Jonathan had also sent an email about doing some specific design reviews, but I have sort of an unordered random list here. We can go through them. I wanted to start with cluster selector because we had a meeting about it last week, and I did summarize summarize our discussion. So I think we did agree that there is a framework where there's a single place where the developer can put his cluster selector restrictions, and there are other policy enforcers, which could be like on shared group of resources, and we could use namespace as that sharing or labels or anything else, or there could be admin OPA policy agent that Turin is doing, and all of them will update that single cluster selector, and we can split them into spec and status, where one is which the developer set and status is the combined one. And we discussed two ways where we can store this cluster selector. One can be on the resource itself or as a separate policy, as a separate extension resource. And that is being discussed in the other proposal, which is like how to add federation specific attributes to Kubernetes API objects. And Jonathan has documented some of the ways, and we will discuss them more here as well. But I think we've discussed it enough that we can move forward with an annotation-based approach for cluster selector. And while we discuss this general problem of how to extend federation, how to add federation-specific attributes, and since we have that, we agree on the framework, and we agree that there's this one place where we'll specify cluster selectors, whether it's a field on the resource or whether it's a separate extension object or whatever way we come up with. We should be able to change that later. But for an alpha feature, starting by annotation seems good to me. I want to know if anyone wants to object.
I don't have an objection exactly, but I think that there's one gotcha around the putting it per resource, which is we have the opportunity to, when we move forward past annotations, we have the opportunity to say, convince Kubernetes that they need to put a federation metadata field on object meta so that all objects just will inherit that. But there's no equivalent mechanism to provide status across all objects. And I would argue that we do actually want to be able to track status of like how we resolve conflicts, say, between policy and the user's intent and that sort of thing. So just that, even though, yes, it's possible that we do go per resource, I think that requirement suggests that a separate policy object or a separate resource, not policy, may be a good idea. That's all.
So I agree we want to track status, but it's still not clear to me why does that enforce a separate resource? Like you had proposed last time, like even in the resource, if we have like an extension object, there itself we can have both spec and status. So like whatever fields the user sets, they are in the spec of that extension object, and there's a status for the extension.
Also, another possibility is to have separate fields for a federation field in status and meta, if it makes sense.
Yeah.
I guess my point is, though, that status is defined per resource. There's no mechanism to provide a common status, like federation status, across all types. It would have to be per type. We would have to provide a federation status field. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So what Madhu said, if we go with the third route where we like maybe fork or have our own definitions of API resources.
Oh,
then
right. Okay.
You'll be able to do this. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess in principle, I don't like that idea, just because that means every single resource we have to define our own type for it. And that's just for Kube, but also, I'm looking at extending this to support origin, and that means we'd have to have anybody who wants to federate anything has to define their own custom types.
Yeah.
If we could avoid that, I think that would be better.
And while talking to you, another similarity in Kubernetes is they also have a concept of like generation. So all resources in Kubernetes have generation, and then in status there's an observed generation. So maybe there's a use case for a generic field in all status as well.
Also, Maru, to answer, to address your concern, does it solve your problem if we build a mechanism to actually have some sort of a generation mechanism or copying mechanism to copy all the fields from Kubernetes to Federation and always keep them up to date, like the same way we run update scripts today?
I mean, I think it's, don't get me wrong, it's a solution. I just think it's definitely not the simplest solution. And I'm always like, that would be my preference for something that didn't add a lot of overhead, and customizing the types seems like overhead to me. If that's the only way we can do it, then sure. But I would vote for trying to see if we can maybe use a separate object versus a specific federation type per resource we want to federate. But yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, and yes, we do want to suggest or discuss the, I think, 3 alternatives which we have right now, and maybe this is a good time to do that. So just, I don't know who all have read Jonathan's doc, and maybe we want to give an overview of the choices we discussed.
I would suggest, like, we have other things on the agenda.
Yeah.
And I think I would say let's go through that, and if we have time at the end. But we kind of talked about the possibility of having design-specific meetings.
Yeah, and I agree, like, we can easily spend an hour on this.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be good to move on to other stuff and talk about this at the end.
Okay, we can come back to it.
But for those who are interested, I'd recommend checking out the doc and getting a sense for what we're talking about if you're not up to date.
Awesome. Next item I had on the designs was federated jobs. I put it here because, like, we've been sort of punting it a lot. I just wanted to make sure people have reviewed. Is there enough feedback? I was looking at the doc. It looked fairly small. I haven't looked at it in detail, and I don't see Janhui here, but I wanted to make sure this has got enough reviewers and is approved. Or
just a quick comment. This is Deepak. So yeah, this has been reviewed, I think, before as well, and he's in the process putting together end-to-end testing as well. So it's almost done actually. So it's pretty much ready.
Actually, my comment was more on the design doc itself. Like, is it reviewed and is it approved? Or I see open comments.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's still being worked on, or I think Maru was assigned federated jobs, but like as we discussed, we should discuss it in the SIG as well. Maybe if Janu is not here this time, we can discuss it next time.
This is Quentin here. I reviewed the document in quite a bit of detail, and I think all of those issues, I mean, they might not actually have the resolve button clicked, but all of the questions people have asked that I'm aware of have been answered. And I don't think there's much contentious, if any contentious stuff left in the design.
Okay.
I'm reasonably comfortable if we move ahead. If anyone wants to have a look at it and comment, they're obviously welcome, but it's been through quite a bit of review already.
I think the only thing that I've been thinking about is that, I mean, Jonathan's already started work on moving replica sets over to the new sync controller, and I think I'm hoping 1.7 we'll be able to move jobs over as well. So I guess my expectation would be if we do merge this, that probably it's going to be refactored before the end of the cycle, just so we're not adding a whole bunch more duplicated code like all the other controllers.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that's a perfectly reasonable expectation. And we might, depending on when that stuff, is that stuff available for use already?
It's in progress. So that, like, I'm not necessarily suggesting that we block merging this stuff, just that we don't have an expectation that we're just going to merge it and leave it. We're going to merge it and then use it as the basis for a refactor.
Perfectly sensible. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and I think last Friday we were discussing that the replica set controller also watches all pods on the underlying clusters, and maybe jobs would have that same problem.
Yeah.
I don't see anything where it says it's going to watch all pods, but I assume it will be.
No,
Oh.
it doesn't. It doesn't watch all pods. It just creates jobs in all the underlying clusters and watches the job status, not the pod status.
Okay, that's probably what I plan to do, sort of unrelatedly for replica sets too, because it feels like watching all pods and underlying clusters is a
So then how
big
does it
scalability
figure out
problem.
if the underlying cluster is out of resources and it should rebalance, or does it not do rebalance right now?
Yes, it does. It looks at the completions of the jobs, from what I recall. But just to clarify something, Jonathan, so replica sets are already done and dusted, and they don't watch pods. So what?
It does watch pods right now. So the replica set controller, to do scheduling and balancing, watches all of the pods in the underlying clusters.
Oh, that was something that came afterwards, which I think got merged in while I wasn't watching. But yeah, I disagree with that approach, and I would just revert that PR, quite frankly.
Excellent.
If it's the one I'm thinking of.
We talked about this last week, and I think we kind of determined that like watching all pods is a poor way to accomplish the goal of being able to know when a replica set has not been able to schedule enough pods.
Yeah.
And rather than watching all pods, it should be possible to look at the replica sets, and when they don't schedule enough resources, you can check the pod status to see why, but you don't have to watch pods to do that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I missed that PR. I think it happened while I was kind of away for a few months. But I'm happy to go and re-review that PR and revert it if it's causing trouble, which I would imagine it is. Yeah.
I think it'll just get fixed as part of the refactor and just carry over.
I think at this point it's so far buried. I think that to revert it would be, I don't know if it would be easy to just revert it automatically. I think I'll just remove that as part of the refactor.
Yeah, I'll leave it up to you. I mean, revert and then refactor versus refactor and then pull all those pieces out. I would imagine the former is easier, but if the latter turns out to be easier for you, that's fine.
Awesome. I will do the easy thing.
So looking at the job design, it
Sorry,
does say,
just to clarify, does anyone have any objection to that? I think, Deepak, maybe you had something to do with that in the past. Is there any problem with reverting it?
No, who initiated that PR? I don't think I was involved in that.
Yeah, I think you were, if it's the one I'm thinking of. I forget. Anyway, you and I can take it offline.
Okay.
so looking at the job design, this also says that it's going to watch all pods and underlying clusters. Otherwise, it will need changes to the status field, which would be an API change.
I'll go and double check that. Oh, because I'll have to have a double check. I agree, it should not watch pods. And if it is, then I've done a poor job of reviewing things. I'll have another look.
Yeah, okay. Okay, I'll also try to take a look. Yeah, okay. Next was read-only access to cluster objects. Is Cindy here?
Yeah, Cindy is not here, but yeah, she's working on the design document and she will publish it.
Okay.
Just
So
one
I'd
comment
also-
on that. I know we decided that it was going to be a tall order to get that into 1.7, but I'd like us to get very close to getting it in 1.7. At least have all the code written, and it seemed to me like we could get pretty close to getting it in 1.7 and maybe even squeeze it in, as opposed to only have a goal of having a design document by the 1.7 deadline, which I don't think would be a particularly good outcome for that.
Okay.
So I think my only, I don't know, I'm just kind of thinking about the implications of getting access to all cluster objects. I'm assuming you're talking about any resource that the Federation control plane has access to. I'm just wondering, like, I'm thinking of differential auth, like I have the ability to do something in the Federation control plane, and then the Federation control plane needs access to the underlying clusters, maybe greater than what I have to be able to do its work in the individual clusters. Like, has that issue come up at all? Because that seems like the most complicated part of that to me.
Well, I mean, so to be clear, what I would like us to I think we can do some of the design and some of the implementation in parallel here. I think the primary parts of the design are, you know, how to execute this stuff. Is it via proxy? Is it via caching? What does it watch in the underlying clusters? All that kind of stuff. And I think that we can resolve in the design document. I agree with you that the permission stuff is interesting, but in a sense, it's not much different than all the other permissions questions that we have that Nikhil's busy working on at the moment. My expectation is that we will use exactly what Nikhil's working on in parallel, which looks like it's panning out to be, you know, some sort of separate authorization enforced in each cluster for each user of the federation. So, you know, Bob tries to list all of his pods across all clusters, and he doesn't have permission to list pods in, you know, XYZ cluster. There's definitely a question about how do you handle that error? How do you communicate to the user that they can't actually see all the pods, they can only see the pods in the clusters which they have permissioned on? I agree that those are, you know, interesting questions to answer, but I think other than those edge cases, we can get pretty far with the rest.
I think the kind of case I was more worried about was like, you know, maybe one user is federating secrets and another user is not really permitted to see those. They can just consume them, or their resources can consume them or something like that. But I mean, you're right, it's largely separable, but when you talk about caching and like, I don't know, it just, if there are people from SIG auth here, they'd probably be getting goosebumps by now.
Yeah, no, the plan is not to do caching in the first iteration, just to be clear. And yes, there are some auth questions to be answered. I don't believe many of them are specific to this feature. They're actually general federation auth questions, which are being resolved in parallel. And I think we should perhaps deal with some separately.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure it was on the agenda.
Makes sense. Cool.
Yep. Okay. For stateful sets design proposal.
I'm afraid I have not, as promised, been able to review that yet, but maybe I'll start on it today and actually make some progress. But at the same time, I think that the outcome of the discussion last week around doing design review, you know, on alternating weeks in this meeting, I think anything of significance in stateful sets arguably fits that criteria, should be reviewed kind of as a group. And maybe we can have primary reviewers that try to dig a bit deeper to be able to, you know, answer questions that people have. But I definitely don't think I should be the only person looking at this.
Yeah.
Is that federated? Sorry, would somebody mind projecting the meeting notes? I think we're done. Is it just me that's looking at federated job on the screen at the moment, or is that?
Yeah, I switched tabs, so now you should be seeing the notes.
Not yet. Something must have gone wrong. Okay. No. Yeah, I've reviewed the stateful set stuff in a fair bit of detail as well. Yeah, a lot of detail. So yeah, feel free to go for it, but you're not alone. Don't worry.
Yeah, so this actually sort of comes back again to that same question. So should we have like these individual owners or reviewers, or like should we do design reviews as a group, and like maybe the author of the design can come and talk about it for first 10-15 minutes, and then people can ask questions? Because otherwise I've seen like and we were discussing this, like for a lot of these docs, people send them out and not everyone looks at them. Maybe one or two of us will look at it, and later on we find out, oh, there are these problems. So maybe it's good that if the author comes and everyone and explains, like just gives an overview.
We need both. I mean, socializing design to the wider group means that as many stakeholders as possible get to participate. But at the same time, when it comes to like shepherding like PRs through, you need someone who's really dedicated at a lower level to be able to push it and communicate with the author, etc. So we're not replacing individual design with group design, we're augmenting.
I agree. I also think that the design review, maybe a quick introduction to the design when it starts, but I don't want that to turn into just design explanations, because I don't think it's a good use of time to have everyone sitting in a room for 15 minutes just talking about the design, unless I mean, if the design is that, if people can't understand the design and we have to do that, I think that's a sign that the design needs to be rewritten and brought to a later design review. Like by the time we get to the design review, I want to understand the design and just be talking about the concerns I have, because that would make that half an hour really useful. That's when we're all together, we can talk about things quickly, resolve things, rather than just learning what the design is.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think a large room of people who haven't read a design in any detail yet and are coming up with questions that have already been discussed and resolved elsewhere is not necessarily productive use of everyone's time. I do agree that not everybody has time to read through the details of every design. I mean, one option we could have is well, two that I can think of that might make sense. One is to request that every design has an executive summary at the beginning, which doesn't go into great detail. You don't have to read the 10-page design document or whatever it happens to be, but at least in 1 or 2 paragraphs, you can get a pretty concise explanation of how it works with the key points. This thing creates these things, the underlying clusters, authorizations handle like this, these things are watched, this is cached, this is not cached, etc. And then, all the detail further down. That's one possible approach, and maybe we can go through those executive summaries, 2 minutes, 3-4 minutes per feature in this meeting. Another option is to have a separate dedicated design review meeting, so that not all the review happens in documents, but there's actually an explicit presentation by the author, and anyone who's interested in that specific design can, spend half an hour or whatever. And I would suggest that a prerequisite for that is that the people attending must have actually read the entire document.
I think the latter was what we were intending, and using like the Monday meeting on alternate weeks for doing a design review as you're described.
Okay. I got the impression that it was people who had not had time to read the document.
No.
Wanting to get an update on it, but maybe.
Oh no. It was like you'd have the opportunity, you'd get forewarning. It's like next week we're going to review this, and depending on how much time would be required, maybe we could do more than one in a given session. But people would come prepared and actually participate in more or less a formal design review.
Okay, and everybody who wasn't didn't have time to read the document before, or wasn't particularly interested in that specific feature, would just not attend.
Exactly.
Okay, that
Or
makes
just
sense.
not talk, either way.
Cool, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it makes sense to maybe do 2 like 30 minutes each. Or
We can see how it goes. I mean, for some things, maybe it'll just, I don't know. I would be tending to maybe give more time initially, and if we find we have extra time, then squeezing things in, as opposed to trying to rush any one thing.
Yeah, it seems like we've got a fair backlog of these things at the moment. There are at least 4 or 5 fairly major designs that I'm aware of that are kind of nearing completion at this point.
No.
So if we only do one every second week, that's going to take 10 weeks to get through the backlog. So yeah,
That's a good point. Maybe we do have to squeeze it a bit.
Yeah, I think we might have to do at least 2 a week at least for now. I mean, if we can see how that works, if it's really not working, if there are major issues that aren't being resolved in the meetings or we're just not finished, then we might have to adjust or schedule more reviews if we think we need them. But I guess we can try it maybe next week, try 2 and see what happens.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so I'll go and update that. I made a spreadsheet and sent it out I'll go update that so it's the other week. I already put the Federation API object, Federation attributes on the APIs as something to review, but that was really just because it was Friday afternoon and I wanted to put something. If there's things that we think are more important, we can decide to review those next week.
for next week specifically, I think we've also invited Eric Feta.
Oh, for next week?
Yeah.
Okay.
So maybe we can do half hour Eric and half hour.
I don't think you'll have a full half hour. I think it'll be 50 minutes or so, 20 minutes.
Yeah. So we can keep other 30, 40 minutes so we can do one design review.
Okay.
Okay. So
Sounds good. Does somebody do we want to just prioritize those design reviews given
Yeah,
how
I was
long
gonna
it will
suggest
take to get through them?
Yeah, I agree. We should prioritize them. Are there any other things that we need to get to in this meeting? It looks like there's testing CI updates, and then I don't know if there's design reviews.
Yeah, this is.
Just a quick comment though about the design documents thing. There are two things already in progress. The federated HPA thing. Maybe that's because that's already in progress, so we didn't include that, or is that something we missed it? The Irfan has been working on it for a while, and Quinton has done a very extensive. Marcin has done a very detailed review as well.
No, I guess I just missed it.
Yeah. And there's one more actually, which the resource quota thing. So we haven't published the design. VGN has been working on it, so we kind of going through the initial internal design review and all that. So hopefully next week we'll publish that as well.
Is that meant for 1.7?
Yeah.
That's a little concerning with this many outstanding designs to have a design that the Federation hasn't seen with like 2 or 3 weeks until the code freeze. I feel kind of.
If it's not in the feature repo, it's going to be hard to push through.
Well, the feature repo date was extended.
But I can add some color there. I reviewed that document last week, and I don't think it's going to make it into 1.7. So I think we can scratch that off the list of stuff that's feasible for 1.7.
No, that's. I think Quinton mentioned about the resource quota thing.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry, that's what I meant. Did I say something?
No, he's yeah.
Sorry. So there's a separate one for
HPA. Yeah.
It's already up there.
It's already up there. Federated HPA. G.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Got it. Okay.
All right. Do we want to prioritize these? How and what order they should be reviewed?
First of all, how ready are they? Like D, the read.
So I wanted to talk about the user identity one. I can do it next week, or we can prioritize others.
That is for 1.7.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess that's the criteria for prioritization is what's in 1.7.
I think all of these
In one letter.
Yeah.
Well, some are stretched for 1.7. Some are not feasible. Some we haven't heard of for a long time. At least in the context of the SIG.
So quota and read-only access are the ones that are unlikely to make 1.7.
Okay.
Jobs is done and has been fairly extensively reviewed. I'd like us to get to that one reasonably soon. And then stateful sets and HPA have been through, I think HPA, in fact, I think both of those have actually been through fairly extensive public review. I don't know how many people in this group got involved in those reviews, but certainly people like Clayton and Marcin from HPA and these guys have been extensively involved in both of those. Which doesn't mean to say we shouldn't review them here, but yeah, they are not unseen to the public, in case that was the impression.
Yeah, I know jobs we've been like sort of pushing down for a while, so we should prioritize that.
Sounds like we should prioritize everything.
Yeah.
So I think we have these 4, right? Unless I'm missing something. Jobs. Oh, there was.
There's also federated. Yeah.
So we have 5. Right?
I don't fully understand what B is, but maybe I should look at the link.
B, stateful sets.
No, federation-specific attributes for Kubernetes API document.
Oh, so this is how to add federation-specific fields to Kubernetes API objects. So either we have our own definitions, or maybe add an extension object, or like for everything for which we're using annotations right now, figure out.
Okay, makes sense. I haven't reviewed that, but I can give it a look.
Yeah. So I think, the user identity one and jobs one, we can start with these 2.
Yeah,
and next have stateful sets and HPA.
that sounds reasonable. I
And
don't think,
implementation
I mean, just to
specific
be
updates.
clear, I think stateful sets and HPA, that the implementation will probably go ahead anyway in the meantime, seeing as it's been reviewed by other community members and myself. But we can certainly go back and make adjustments after the review here.
And for next week, so there's Eric coming as well. And if we want to do 2 design reviews next week, maybe we can extend it to 90 minutes. I don't know if that works for everyone, or it's too long and we should schedule a different one.
I don't feel too strongly. 90 minutes is fine by me. The other option is to, keep Eric to 20 minutes and then 20 minutes per design review.
Yeah, 20 minutes is too less for a design review.
And then we also don't get to go through the other topics which might arise during the week. Okay, 90 minutes sounds fine to me. I don't know about anybody else.
Any objections? Going once?
Oh, actually, I won't be able to be here anyway, so I should just be quiet.
Oh.
So it'll be like the middle of night for me.
Or next week you won't be here?
No, but I've reviewed all those designs already, and I've actually spoken with the testing guys, so I don't think that's a problem.
Okay. So I guess we can do 90 minutes next week and fit in those 2 designs.
Yeah. Or we can do some other day of the week, Quinton, if that works for you better. Or
No, I'm gone
Okay.
for 2 weeks, so
okay.
it's not going to work for me. I'll have to see you guys again in 3 weeks' time.
Okay. Okay, sounds good. So we'll do first 2 next time and the next 2 the week after that, and we'll discuss this in more detail on the doc itself. Good. Okay, next is testing CI updates. Madhu, do you want to talk about? I don't see Madhu.
Madhu had to leave at
Oh,
9:30.
Let's see. Yeah. Oops. Okay. I don't know what these before suit are. But yeah, our tests are green, but I don't know what the status of adding them to pre-submit are, like where we are.
There's something still caught up in Ingress, and the GLBC Kubernetes controller person here is working on fixing the issues. The issues only show up when many concurrent Ingress objects are created and deleted within a project, which happens in the pre-submission project. And should be resolved sometime early this week, at which time we should move to officially enabling the pre-submits.
Nice.
Excellent. Christian, is this related to that publicly reported bug that I forwarded to you last week? Is it also going to solve that?
So far, Nick thinks that yes, it's related,
Okay, cool.
but we're working through that separately.
Okay. For build cop rotation, yes. So I guess we can discuss this more next week when Eric is here. He's going to show hopefully a few demos and show us how even external people can look at logs and look at during build cop rotation. And once we have that, then we can set it up. I guess at this point, I'm assuming we do have agreement that we want build cop rotation and we have volunteers. So now it's just about setting it up.
Cool.
Okay. Yeah, we don't have anything else. So yeah, you're doing 90 minutes next week, so we can give you back 20 minutes this week.
Should we take a
Or we
look at the
can-
1/7 calendar, make sure that we're not behind on any? So we got it extended until Friday for
Features.
and I guess there's no other due dates, right?
I think we wrapped up all the features last week, from what I remember.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're on track for features. I'm just wondering for release 1.7 what the next dates are.
Yeah, that might be worth having a quick look. Code freeze and whatever. I assume code freeze is 3 or 4 weeks time from now.
Yeah, month end.
Does anyone know the dates offhand?
June 1st is the beginning of feature freeze,
Okay. Beginning of feature freeze.
which presumably means basically the only PRs that are going in are either fixing a bug or related to a feature, and that's June 1st.
Yeah, so we have a month.
And test fixes, yeah.
Yeah.
And then the proposed release date for 1.7 is at the end of June.
Yes, 20th June.
Awesome.
Hi, it's Shashi here. I had a couple of things actually. I was working on leader election for control manager. So I was a little blocked on that cluster selector.
Yeah.
So I would I think design most of it is complete, I believe. So the implementation wise, I think, is there anything blocking there? Why it is not moving?
You mean design for leader election or for cluster selector?
Cluster selector.
Yeah, okay. So we were just discussing it earlier on. And yeah, we do want, for now, we'll want to move forward with the annotation based approach, but we do want to resolve how, like the second item, federation specific attributes, how we'll do it generally for others. And yes, so we will move forward, and Dan has a PR which is in review, and hopefully that can be merged soon enough. So that would unblock you.
Oh, okay, sure. And also another PR I raised for segregating the DNS controller from the service controller. So probably if you haven't looked at, I think Quinton and Nikhil, I think you are assigned to that. Probably you can have a look. Maybe it's not a priority. Just a few scheme of things, it will work out what we wanted to do for using the federation in on-premises clusters.
Yeah, sorry, I was out of office the whole of last week, so I've got a bit of a backlog. I'll try and clear that in the next couple of days.
Yeah, thanks, Quinton. Yeah, sure.
Hey Shashi, you were also waiting for the interface thing, for the leader election as well, though. Is that sorted out?
It's not started yet. I think probably it's a small thing. I think it's with Mike Dennis.
Okay.
I'll remind him again.
Okay.
I thought I saw that it actually approved that LGTM'd it, but maybe I missed it.
Yeah, actually, initially I was touching more than the leader election package, so it needed an approval from lot many guys.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else? Yeah, and for user identity, I actually went to Sagoth last week, or was it the week before? And I've summarized the feedback I got from them regarding impersonation. So maybe you guys can take a look.
Yeah, I saw that feedback. All I saw was problem statements as opposed to proposed solutions.
Yeah, yeah. Those were some of the concerns, and like one of the major or high level thing was we are adding more complexity, and like auth guys were, you're adding more complexity to the auth system and adding more chances of bugs, which in turn would lead to even more auth bugs. Was the high level feedback,
I mean,
which is yeah. Go ahead.
I mean, feedback I got from David Eads when he took a look at the doc was you guys are still considering doing impersonation, and kind of like a little bit shocked and surprised because it just seems like there's just so many pitfalls. And I wonder if better first step would just be enabling think we talked about this last week, like just the idea of just, you know, the user can have a different user per cluster that has whatever access it needs. But the idea that you're like, you're trying to synchronize who's accessing federation with who's like specific users that are accessing the underlying clusters. Like, what are the use cases around that? Because I know people want something, but it's not clear to me what problem that's solving given just how much complexity is involved.
Yeah. So one of the problem is the one you raised for reading underlying resources as well. Like you said, federation would have access to, let's say, like multiple namespaces and many resources, but one user has access only to, like you said, read deployments only. He can't read resources. But because if federation is using its own identity to talk to the underlying clusters, he can escalate his privileges by using federation.
But that, I guess that suggests that there's, like, rather than trying to do operations per user, that maybe like you have a user per namespace, because that seems to be like the security like level of granularity that Kubernetes supports today, like with RBAC. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so that was another feedback I got, and I don't see it here. But yeah, I had filed another issue for discussing an alternate implementation where we would use namespace scoped service accounts. So right now, federation uses one single credentials to talk to each cluster, but that single credential is for all namespaces on that cluster. And yeah, this is one of the idea that Clayton also suggested, that rather than using per user, we do per namespace service accounts.
Can't RBAC roles be scoped to particular objects though too?
They
Yes.
can, but
Well,
the issue is, like, you can set roles that way, but that isn't really good for automated mechanisms like watches. Do you get my meaning?
that makes sense though. But so are we saying if Kubernetes, so right now a user can have a role that lets them access only pods in a cluster,
Yeah.
and we're not going, so if a user
They can
has
be
that,
named pods in a cluster. Like, you can only access a pod named foo.
so
But the problem with that is like, then it kind of sets up a chicken or egg problem where the federation control plane needs to know what it has access to, but it's federating what it has access to. And how does it set up the roles? Like, it almost sets up like you need one mechanism in the federation control plane that sets up the expected access rules that it's going to require, and it needs basically super user privileges. And then there's, you know, a user basically operating on behalf of a restricted user that requires those authorization primitives. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and to add to the use case you were saying, like there are authorization rules at the federation level as well. So if a user only has access to some specific deployments, if the admin ensures that the authorization rules are synced, and at federation level also there's the same authorization rule that they can only read deployments but not secrets, then it would work. But in this case, the underlying clusters are sort of trusting federation and ensuring that the same authorization rules synced across. And this would be made easier with federated RBAC, at least the syncing part, but the underlying clusters are still trusting federation to have performed the right authorization.
that makes sense. And is that not an acceptable solution from the SIG off?
That's one of the problem with the current solution we have, that it's a requirement that the underlying clusters have to trust federation.
So it's a requirement that the underlying, it sounds like there are too many requirements, and that their answer is that because you have to change things, it could add bugs, so we don't want you to change things.
No, so one of the other feedback was also, yeah, right now the underlying clusters have to trust federation for authorization. In the new impersonation model, they'll still have to trust it to have performed the right authentication, because then only they are like impersonating the right user. So there is still some trust involved even in impersonation.
Yeah, I don't know. Like,
that's a solvable problem. I mean, as soon as you're using any client that's doing things on your behalf, including kube control, you have to trust that it's actually authenticating you.
the problem isn't the trust, though. It's the level of access. So if I'm giving full access to my cluster, to my underlying cluster, that's what people are worried about, versus the federation control plane has full access to selective namespaces, and outside of that has zero access, and therefore those other namespaces can't be hurt by some sort of random federation issue.
Yeah,
it's
And
hard
also
for,
to reply to what Quinton said, like you said, even clusters have to trust kubectl. Like not really, because kubectl or the user is directly sending his credentials and the cluster gets to authenticate and authorize the user. The cluster is not trusting kubectl
Well,
in any way.
It is though. It's trusting that kubectl is correctly getting the resources and not doing some buggy thing where a user is getting somebody else's credentials. I mean, it's not exactly the same problem, but it's a similar problem of until the user is like walking up and knocking on the door directly and providing their own credentials and verifying themselves directly. If they have any tool in the middle, that tool could have a bug, which could cause an escalation privilege issue.
But from the cluster's perspective, they got a set of credentials and they authenticate and authorize on those credentials. Like if the
No, but
We're not talking about trust, though. We're just talking about limiting the scope of access, potentially, if someone wanted that.
Can I just ask a question to clarify? My understanding was that we don't actually. My understanding is that the proposal on the table is that the Federation control plane uses a specific user account per user per cluster.
Yes.
That's one of the proposals, yeah. Not
And that's the one that I think is the most sensible and which I think addresses many of these. I just want to make sure we're not talking past each other. So my understanding of Nikhil's feedback was that the concern about that proposal was that, Bob goes to Federation and says, please, do stuff in cluster X for me. Federation goes and finds out what token it should use to authenticate Bob against cluster X. And if there's a bug in that logic and it uses the wrong token, then Bob might get to do stuff that Bob's not supposed to be able to do. Is that correct, Nikhil?
Yes.
That's not the concern, though. The concern is that you give full access to your cluster because...
No, you don't give full access to anything. You just, the clusters are completely unaware of what's going on. All they know is that there is a guy, Bob, and he has certain permissions.
So there's one distinction that the underlying cluster has to give impersonation powers to Federation if you want to use the impersonation mechanism. Then Federation would impersonate Bob. And the underlying cluster have to authorize Federation to impersonate other users.
Okay, and the other proposal was that you don't impersonate, that we actually have an external agent which says, I trust that you are acting on behalf of Bob now, and please use this token as Bob to access this cluster.
Yeah, but then Federation would get access to all users' credentials or multiple users' actual credentials. With impersonation, they don't get access to the credentials. Like Federation can go ask this service that give me credentials for Quinton or give me credentials for...
Sure, but those could be limited time credentials that only work, for the Federation for some limited period of time, etc. I guess where I'm going to is, we've asked the auth guys several times what they would like us to do. They tell us to do something. We then propose that, and then they say, no, we don't want you to do that.
I'm not sure that's a fair characterization.
I'm just wondering which...
I think this needs to be driven by use cases.
Ask them that this is the problem we want to solve. Please tell us what you would like us to do. Do you want us to use impersonation? Because previously you told us you did, and now you told us you don't. Would you like us to use the other mechanism whereby short use tokens are issued to the Federation to act on behalf of a user for a limited period of time or a limited number of queries or some other similar thing? Or do you want us to do something else? But tell us what you want to do and we'll do that. I don't personally have a strong feeling about any of these things. I just want us to kind of get over this hurdle where, we come up with a proposal, they say you can't do that, do this instead. We come up with a counter proposal or a proposal based on what we got, and then we get told you can't do that either. That's sort of
why they're pushing back, and it's not just, oh, this is not a good way to do it, we don't want to see that. Like, the issue with impersonation is, how do you know who to impersonate at, like who to impersonate? We don't have field level like access control in Kubernetes, so Federation doesn't get that either. So it's basically last person who touched it, their permissions decide how it gets federated, and that's kind of problematic.
Yeah, I was going to say the same. So yeah.
But that's a different problem. So that one
It is, but I'm saying it's kind of like it's a precondition for deciding how we're going to interact with the underlying clusters is what's the level of granularity for authorization we can actually achieve with Kubernetes today, which is why like I think namespaces are kind of the natural way to do it. You can specify RBAC roles on a per resource basis if you name them, if you're explicit, but it doesn't really generalize to the type of automation that Federation is doing.
Yeah. So to clarify, yeah, there are two different problems. One is figuring out whose credentials to use, and then how to use their credentials. Like get the credentials from an external service or impersonate a user, or maybe there's some other way. So there are these two problems. Yes.
And just to go back to that previous comment, we've only got 4 minutes left, Maru, but I guess I don't totally understand the problem. So user A creates resource X, and it gets that operation, the creation of that object gets propagated down to the cluster as whatever user X maps to in that cluster, right? Now user B updates object X, and that update gets propagated to the cluster as whatever, in the context of whatever user B is in that cluster.
Yeah. So the problem is that the Federation batches updates together. So let's say there was a resource
details. So I think we can fix that. I mean, I think we can decide not to batch them if there's a security concern around that.
But the concern is you can't really track, like whoever touched it owns it, right? I mean, even if you're...
No, that's not true. Whoever touched something owns the thing they touched. And they either have permission to do whatever they did to that thing, where that thing might be a field, or they don't.
This is kind of like in auth world, I created the object, and maybe there's something wrong with the object, and somebody else comes along and doesn't really look at the object carefully, but updates a field. And their access permissions are higher than the initial user. And so it'll be federated with the secondary user's permissions. And I'm just saying, I'm not saying that's like, oh, it's gonna be a problem. I'm just saying there's kind of like, it's potentially a problem. And if you care about authorization and security,
to clarify, I think there are two distinct proposals. The first one is where we'll batch those updates, and in batching, we'll have the problem that Maru is stating, that if one user created it but didn't have the permission to create it in underlying clusters, but the second user just updated it, and he has the authorization to create as well. And if we batch both of them together and send the update as the second user, this will go through. So batching does have the problem that Maru is stating, but the other proposal is what Quentin is saying, batching is an implementation detail. If we don't batch and still send them as two distinct updates, the first update would be creating that resource as user one, and that will fail.
Sure.
And then second update as the second user.
But that's a big detail, right? Like you're talking about actually tracking versions. So you're going well beyond what Kubernetes today does. And that's kind of my consideration. I'm not saying it can't be done.
Yeah.
I'm saying if we decide to go down that road, we're diverging from how Kubernetes works today, and we'll have to support that with all of the potential implications.
Sorry.
Well, where in Kubernetes are they considering this? That's my major concern.
There's nothing... Just to be clear here, I do not want Kubernetes clusters to do anything special for Federation.
I'm talking about the fact that the Federation control plane basically builds on a lot of, I mean, it uses Kubernetes, the API server, and how that behaves. And so you're saying, well, we're going to do this, and that's kind of outside the scope of the Kubernetes API server, and we're just going to support it ourselves. And maybe they'll get that eventually, like field level access control and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So to clarify, I don't think it's out of the scope of Kubernetes API server, since API service it gets updates and stores them in etcd. It's the controller manager which does all of this work. And right now, all Kubernetes controllers do batch, and the way they work is they just observe the current state, desired state, and update the current state to match the desired state, and like push the system towards desired state, and they do batch updates together. And in Federation, if we change that, we'll diverge from the Kubernetes model. Yes, and it is going to be a big change. And yeah, I agree, access or like maintaining a sort of log of which field was updated by each user. And we can go in multiple depths. It won't just be each field. If you consider maps, it's going to be like each key in that map. Let's say I add a label.
Or just certain objects. Like you just keep track of like, this is an object. I mean, object versioning is a thing in most databases that you'd use. And we could use something like that. I'm just saying, like, how are we going to track it? How are we going to, you kind of have to store it, because a watch is not, if you lose connection and you missed a version today, you just basically lose that detail, the way the API server works. And we'd have to extend it so that we'd actually have first-class concept of object versioning. And that's not trivial to me. So, I mean, like I said, my conception is, I don't think we want to go down that road. I think we want to concentrate on less granular authorization so we can just avoid the problem, unless there's a specific use case that requires this capability. Because it kind of seems to me it's a little bit like gold plating. You want this, it'd be really nice to have this, it'd be a great feature, but it's going to be super complicated. And
I agree it's going to be super complicated, but I do think that we have a valid, concrete use case to be able to do this. So for wanting to do this, and the use case is that, like, I as a team or I as an individual have access to multiple clusters, and I should just be able to use Federation without asking admins of those clusters to trust Federation first, to give it some special pass, like create a special service account for Federation or give it impersonation pass or anything. Like, I have access to multiple clusters and I should just be able to use Federation. And those clusters trust me, and Federation would use my credentials to talk to those underlying clusters.
so these clusters have no conception of, like, I mean, the permission model is important there. If you have a permission model that would allow that, I think today that would work. Like, I could set up my own personal federation that federates into clusters that I don't actually admin if I give it access control. But that, I think the limiting factor today is that we don't really have a conception of federating to a partial cluster. We just assume we have full global access.
No, that's not
everything.
No.
No?
No, because you give Federation a special credentials, like a special service account, and you can set RBAC on that service account. So you can use Federation only for deployments or only for replica sets or some
what I'm
particular
talking about
namespaces.
is this. Okay, so the namespaces, maybe I was under the impression after talking to David that if you were to restrict access to an underlying cluster to specific namespaces, like, how would watches work? I want to watch all secrets and everywhere, and I don't have permission to. I only have permission to do that in these namespaces. And it seemed to me he suggested that the only way to do that would actually be to watch the namespaces you have access to and not all namespaces. So I have access to, A, B, and C, but not D, E, and F. I would have to have namespace-specific watches on the 3 namespaces I have access to, rather than a global watch on all namespaces for secrets.
Yes.
Maybe I've missed some detail, or maybe there's a way to do that. But like the way that watches and lists work in Kubernetes, it's not particularly granular. It's kind of like all or nothing, or it's I can do a namespace or everything, but like doing only the things I have access to, I don't think that works today. Maybe we just need to confirm that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So yeah, that's a good point. So when we give Federation a service account, we can restrict it to, like, let's say just 2 namespaces. But the way our controller code is written, it tries to set up watch on all namespaces. And I don't know if it has authorization only on 2 namespaces. Does it get watch notifications only for those 2 namespaces, or it just fails, like, and doesn't get any notification, any watch notification at all? And so
we could check that easily enough. I mean, just but we should probably clarify.
If it is the second case, then we should definitely update our controller to set watches only on namespaces where it has access.
But it's kind of like it's more expensive because you have a lot of namespaces you're watching. Suddenly you have a lot more work to do, potentially. You have a lot more open connections. So I'm not saying, I'm not sure it's a general, like, we just want to watch namespaces individually, because some people maybe want to have access to everything and then it's more expensive for them. So it's kind of something we'd have to explore.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point which I can look into. But we do want to make sure that even with, so in my proposal, I have like 2, single identity and user identity. In the single identity mode, where Federation gets an identity which it always uses to send mutations to underlying clusters, you should be able to restrict that to specific namespaces. We do want to support that. And the other is where it uses user's identity And in that case, federation would be restricted to whatever user is restricted to.
Complicated.
Yeah.
TLDR, sorry.
Yeah, I don't know. I think we might be making it more complicated than it needs to be. Discussing, I think the implementation is perhaps necessarily somewhat complicated, but I think we can separate that from like the security concerns. They seem like two
I think it can be. It just depends on how the problem is solved and just how expansive in scope it is.
Well, I would propose that we first come up with what we believe to be a secure enough proposal, and then worry about how efficiently we can implement that, rather than conflating all of these issues together.
I'm not sure I agree, just because we have a constrained we have a constrained problem, right? We have Kubernetes, we're using Kubernetes, we can't really go too far beyond the bounds of what it already implements. And so if we just pick up a solution that doesn't take that into consideration, we're likely to come up with a bad solution.
That's not quite.
Okay, sorry.
So
I guess yes, for me, what I heard.
One constraint is we have the Kubernetes API,
but
another constraint is that we have to come up with a secure enough design. And if we can come up with a secure enough proposal, we can then try and implement the thing efficiently given the current API. And if we cannot come up with a design for that, then we have at least two options. Come up with a less secure design that we can implement efficiently, or enhance the Kubernetes API so that it can enable us to produce an efficient implementation. And I'm kind of inclined towards saying that a less secure design is just fundamentally kind of not tenable.
But I think I can give a specific instance of where we are sort of constrained by the Kubernetes implementation. Is like, let's take an example of if we want to keep track of which user updated each field. Where do we store that information? Is it in etcd where the objects are stored as annotations, or somewhere else, which is less secure? But if we decide to store it somewhere else, like not in etcd, then we have problems of like atomic updates that we need to ensure that we are updating this log of which user updated the field, and ensure that the field was also updated in etcd. And those two should be an atomic transaction.
Sure. No, I understand that there might be some challenges there. I mean, Kubernetes does not actually grant field level permissions yet. So to some extent, that's worrying about things in the future. You can either create an object or not, and you can either update it or not. And as long as we do a creation operation as the correct user and an update operation as the correct user, today we're as secure as Kubernetes. Right?
Yeah, because Kubernetes is not a field level update.
Exactly. And if in the future they create field level permissions where you can update field X but not field Y, then we need to do the equivalent things in Federation to, achieve that. But I personally, and I mean, we should speak to the auth guys, that seems like a really difficult thing to do given the status of RBAC, and like that will be a big long-term change to Kubernetes. And I can't see it happening like in 1.8. And we should, be involved in that discussion if it is going to happen, and figure out how to deal with it. But there are many examples of things that may or may not come down the line in Kubernetes that we will have to, deal with, as will all the other clients, quite frankly. We're just a client of a Kubernetes cluster. If they change to field level access, well, then those clients are all going to have to do those kinds of things.
It's pretty unlikely that's going to happen at all, to be honest. Just the way that etcd is structured doesn't make that easy. As much as people want to invent a relational database on top of a blob store.
I don't understand what you meant by that, Maru.
I mean that etcd, I mean, you have more experience with, that type of thing. I mean, presumably etcd is modeled after what people think they know about something like Chubby. But like Kubernetes is kind of like growing all of these niceties that you would normally have like in relational database land, like, you know, field level access control, which kind of involves like, say, a more fixed idea of a schema. And so we're kind of like building this into the API server.
etcd, just to be clear, this is Kubernetes API.
Sure, it does and it doesn't though, because I mean, yeah, you can do everything at the API server, but fundamentally there's kind of constraints on what you're doing if the underlying data store is completely oblivious to that, especially when you get into things like object versioning. Anyway, I'm just saying that to me, it's like there's certain assumptions baked into how things are working, and you know, there's only so far that it's malleable without breaking a lot of those assumptions.
Yeah. So, but just to clarify, you both are saying that field level versioning is going to be tough and you don't see it happening soon enough, right?
Well, there's versioning and there's permission.
Access control, yeah.
And there's a-
So we don't see both of them, field level versioning and access control, happening anytime soon.
I'm speculating that we should check with the people considering these things, but it's not in our back at the moment, and it seems like a big change. So it seems like a reasonable tentative assumption that it's going to take a while, and we should verify that with the auth guys.
Yeah.
That was the impression I got speaking to the RBAC people like a month ago. In which case, at least figuring out something that works on the current model now would be useful.
Yeah. So I was just verifying that Maru is also trying to say the same thing, that because of the way etcd works and the way Kubernetes is structured right now, field level access control and versioning is not something we can implement soon enough. Right, Maru?
Yeah, and my interactions with the auth guys kind of mirrors your experience, Quentin, that it's not going to happen. I mean, it's not in the near term. And the reason I was bringing up like how etcd is kind of how it functions, you know, maybe the API server is nominally independent, but from a realistic perspective, the cost of implementing field level access control would be considerable in terms of performance. It would be a real scale issue, and they have a lot of other scale issues they need to address before they target something that big.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. So I think we do have a sort of clearer path for figuring out like who to impersonate, have top level created by user and the one who last updated it. But we still need to figure out how to impersonate, like whether impersonate or use the credentials or ask SIG auth for if there's another way of doing it.
Yeah, that sounds excellent. And I'm leaning towards asking SIG auth which of the two you want to do for the second of the items you mentioned. Ask them what you want. Ask them what they want you to do. As opposed to poking holes in whatever you propose.
Okay, yeah, so that is good feedback for me. And what are you doing next?
Cool. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Cool. I think we ran out of time long ago, so.
Great.
But it's been a useful exercise, a useful discussion.
Yeah, this was definitely useful, at least for me.
No, that's good. This is a big enough problem that it's probably was worth discussing.
Christian looks less convinced that it was useful.
No, I think it was useful, but I think what's clear is that, especially in this path, we still have to let part of the implementation inform the design. And not straight go from a design document and be wishful that it'll be implementable, right?
Yeah, I agree with you. I guess what I was trying to subvert is us just going round and round and round in circles, not being able to come up with a design that was perfectly implementable and perfectly secure, and at least break it into pieces and say, this we believe, if we could implement this, it would be secure. So then we can at least remove the security problems from the table, and then we can focus on the performance problems or implementability problems, as opposed to just having a big bucket of nondescript problems on the table and not being able to get rid of all of them at once. Because each one of those set of problems involves different groups. So that, you know, whether it's secure or not involves SIG auth, and whether it's implementable enough via the Kubernetes API, involves SIG API or whoever, and whether we can implement it efficiently internally in Federation is like our thing. So let's at least attempt to carve those up into pieces that we can solve, that we can focus on one area at a time, as opposed to trying to solve all of these buckets of things across multiple SIGs all at the same time. That was, I guess, my overall suggestion.
Understood. And in my experience dealing with security, it's never about the best design. It's mostly about the least distasteful design, and that's kind of how you make progress. And I think this is
Totally agree with you. And scalability, you know, seems to me to be like in the distasteful category, whereas insecurity seems to be in the unpalatable category. So let's focus on something that is at least as secure as Kubernetes, and then worry about scalability and how we make that, you know, scale to large numbers of clusters or large numbers of users or whatever the problem might be. And that might be a phase 2. You know, maybe a secure implementation like doesn't scale beyond some, you know, 10 clusters and 10 users or something. And I would be like reasonably okay with that. If you want security, this is where we are scalability wise, and we're working on improving that over time. If scalability is your big deal, well, then you can switch off the security knob and then you can scale to, you know, thousands of clusters or whatever. I can't imagine that would be very attractive, but at least we can start chipping away at the problem.
great. Okay.
All right.
Awesome.
Cool.
Oh my God.
Thank you.
Thanks,
See you guys
everyone.
next week.
Ciao.
Thank you.